if you maybe don't want to admit that there's something fishy going on, there's enough cover to where you can kind of try to interpret it in a more conservative way.
Here we go. Welcome to a special edition of the Focusing Way podcast. I'm your host, David Battistella. We call these special editions The Way is Love. Find The Focusing Way on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and our website, thefocusingway.com. Saint Gallen Mafia, Exposing the Secret Reformist Group Within the Church, is the title of an intriguing, challenging, and thought-provoking book by Julia Meloni. She meticulously pieces together documented events and writings surrounding power struggles within the Roman Catholic Church, leading up to and after the death of Saint Pope John Paul II.
I think that they had to have known that Ratzinger as a cardinal had said in different ways, in different forms, that a pope could abdicate under certain circumstances. Basically, just in other words, it's not inconceivable. Kind of getting people used to the idea, admitting that it could happen, all of that, and certainly. Later when he was Pope in 2010, he gave an interview to Peter Seewald and said that there are certain circumstances where a Pope may have the duty to abdicate. I think that the Mafia, so the book, one of the mysteries that the book talks about is just, that 2005 conclave. And I talked before about how Silvestrini identified Bergoglio as a great candidate. And whoever the mysterious cardinal was of Confession of a Cardinal, maybe it was Silvestrini, maybe not. Whoever he was, he said that he and his group of people had thought of Bergoglio. So you have this backing of Bergoglio from some mafia members and mafia allies, but then the book talks about how Martini didn't want Martini was a Jesuit and Bergoglio was a Jesuit, and they had not always been in lockstep with each other on what was best for the church. Basically, Bergoglio in his earlier days had been seen as being very conservative and ultra-conservative. And so I think Martini didn't trust him he didn't think that he was the right person to change the church. And I think that Martini, it looks like from the testimony of many sources that Martini gave his votes to Ratzinger at the end, and told people to vote for Ratzinger. And of course, there's that mysterious conversation. I think that he knew. Basically, his biographer Marco Garzonio says that he believed in Ratzinger and believed that Ratzinger would the way he puts it is kind of like listen to the Holy Spirit or whatever. Mm-hmm. But he believed that we would see some surprises from Ratzinger. So it's very, I don't know, it's the whole issue of the abdication is obviously just a huge mystery, and it's very, it really, it can be very hard, devastating to think about, or very, it's a very, very interesting and thorny topic.
Yeah. No, it certainly gives us a lot to think about. There's no doubt about that. You talked about how Pope Francis thinks in terms of time and space, and this has that philosophy. But he's also, quite a punctual person. Like he's quite interested in being on time, and there's a lot of precision to how he behaves, and he's also you lay out a beautiful story in the book where he had, through a surgery, lost a part of a lung
Mhm.
and was denied the opportunity to go to Japan, which would have been, but then became a school teacher and had this other life, and is very used to the role of sort of laying in wait. And but what's interesting is that there's a lot of very specific times and dates for new papal pronouncements. And especially since Pope Francis's pontificate, often things are announced on important feast days.
Mhm.
Um, it's almost like the antithesis of something where, a new thing is brought in on a day when sort of everyone's paying attention. But can you talk about that kind of thing and what you make of it?
Yeah, there were, I don't know, just there are some kind of strange moves like the Vatican light show that was done on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Um, the there's been one or two times where on an October 13th, Pope Francis has posed with a Martin Luther statue, or I think Traditionis Custodes, the document that severely restricts the Latin Mass and kind of goes against, very, very stringently goes against Summorum Pontificum. I think that was done on the Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. I think that to me, it's strange because, I mean, it makes sense these that these men might behave in this way because, again, if you think about Martini will talk about how in his childhood he he still remembers, going to First Fridays and, waking up, having his mom wake him up, and then they would go to communion and have a chocolate pastry afterwards to celebrate, like that. He lived in that preconciliar church, right? And then, but he talks about how the air was very stale, that whole world, it was boring. So I think by having, these different feast days where, it might be traditional to, to do an old Catholic kind of custom on those days, and then instead you're seeing a strange light show, or getting Traditionis Custodes or something like that. It's just kind of like mapping the revolution and kind of the juxtaposition between the two worlds right onto the feast days. I mean, they're communicating a message
Mm-hmm.
by the timing of everything.
And you point out also how often Pope Francis seems to quote or paraphrase the late Cardinal Martini. Do you maybe want to talk about a few examples where you sort of saw or heard things coming from Pope Francis, which would have been sort of easily something you would have heard Cardinal Martini say?
Yeah. So when I basically, again, Martini to me, he's kind of he's the center of gravity for the book, because he was really the one that propelled my research onto this, because I there was a point where I had read The Dictator Pope, and the first chapter is about the Saint Gallen Mafia. The Dictator Pope is, of course, by Henry Cyr. And that first chapter, there was this little section, maybe like 6 or 8 paragraphs about Martini. But I just hadn't really known very much about Martini. But the way it presented it, it was so interesting to me that I stopped, reading the book temporarily, and I downloaded Martini's book, Night Conversations. And I just stayed up that same night reading Night Conversations. And I recognized stuff that there were things he said in there where I said, I've heard this before, and I've heard it from Pope Francis. And I wrote an article a couple months after that where I pointed out that Martini had this thing where he would talk about this quote from Joel about your sons and daughters prophesying. And Martini loved to use that to talk about. Martini was had a lot of, I don't know, friendships with young people and loved young people, and they loved him. And this was around the time where we were preparing for the synod on young people. And I had wondered, why is there going to be a synod on young people? Like, where is this coming from? And then I read this book, Night Conversations, which is presented as a series of questions from young people to Martini. And then he talks about young people constantly and how they need to be like updating the church and being prophets and everything like that. So then I thought, this is where the synod on young people is coming from. And then I found where Pope Francis is quoting Joel, the prophet Joel, and using it in the same way as Martini about young people like criticizing the church, young people updating the church. I put it in the book, but it was really things like that where I said, sometimes he quotes Martini overtly, and the book talks about some of the times. There was a part more recently in the past couple of years where he gave one of his Christmas addresses, and he overtly said, like, here are some words from Martini that should make us think. And he talked about how the church he quoted the part about the church needing to be updated because it was 200 years behind. But even Austin Ivory, the papal biographer, says that basically Bergoglio had a habit of quoting Martini. So this is something that I just see as being like very, like, it's not as if Martini is just this kind of tangential person or there's this perfunctory interest in his work and everything. I think Bergoglio for a long time had been very interested in the thought of Martini.
I just want to go to this idea of language. And much of how the church moves is through the creation of documents that get, in a traditional parliamentary kind of setting, you talk about a law being, going to first and second and third reading, and, things that get written and rewritten and, revised and sent back, and this sometimes over a period of several years. But I would like to talk about this use of language and how the documents they craft. You have a master's degree in English from Harvard University. How is language being used by the Saint Gallen Mafia?
Yeah, I think that in Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis's post-synodal exhortation after the family synods, we see an example of something that kind of gets us thinking. Basically, the proposal for communion for the divorced and civilly remarried, he could have just come out and said, I want to adopt the Casper proposal everywhere. He could have just said it, right? He could have cited picked something to cite or whatever. But instead, there's this whole hermeneutical battle over how do we interpret Amoris Laetitia. And basically, like, there are things from one footnote that reference something else, and they reference another document. And it's like this, this very kind of indirect way of speaking and everything. So basically, it's kind of like, I look at it this way. If you are kind of, if you maybe don't want to admit that there's something fishy going on, there's enough cover to where you can kind of try to interpret it in a more conservative way. But if you like actually kind of put the logical chain together and go through it, it's not exactly ambiguous. It's more circuitous and roundabout. This was something one of the I think Claudio Pierantoni, who has written some really interesting articles on this pontificate. He said something like that. Amoris Laetitia, it's not exactly ambiguous. It's more that it's indirect and everything. Now, this kind of affinity for indirection, I see this as just completely in line with what the mafia members wanted to have happen. Because again, these were men, they did not want to create a schism in the church. They did not want to be a new Martin Luther in the sense of breaking away. They wanted to stay inside the church and be on good terms with the church. And when they speak Martini, a lot of the early Martini is very like elusive and suggestive, and you can see he's hinting towards something progressive, but he won't like come right out and say it because he doesn't want to get pinned for saying something too revolutionary. It's just very similar to some of the moves that we see and later on from other people, basically.
Wasn't there a moment where this document had gone back and forth, and at the end they were like, no, but we got that one line in there, and they knew that 30 years down the line that would be the sentence that they would be able to refer back to open that can of worms again, and to keep the dialogue, or keep the agenda alive in a sense.
Yeah, there are some things where, for instance, the book doesn't quite go into this very much, but there are some parts of Amoris that talk about that quote the Vatican II document Gaudium et Spes, and basically try to use that to interpret that in a certain way that says that, that hints that there might be some development on the issue of contraception. But then they kind of like left that alone for a while. But then you had other theologians who were coming in and kind of filling in the spaces. Again, these are the image of seeds, the image of you have to plant the seeds and you have to give them time to grow and stuff like that. So there are lots of different, I see that this is something where there are lots of different ideas that are being seeded and planted. And, it wasn't time to harvest the issue of ordination of married men. But their time is coming, and that's, it's again, Pope Francis is planting a lot of seeds, and Martini called himself the antipope, the ante, the antecedent, the precursor. And then it's just kind of an interesting question: are there going to be any more preparatory people, or what's next? Are we going to get the harvester, next?
Yeah. You give, I'm just going to read from the book because there's a great example I have here of a theologian, Eve Congar, and the overall strategy, because it really it's very concise. Open quote. And so Congar set a very important condition for changing the church without inducing schism. Quote, having patience with delays. Congar proposed to change the church from within through a reform without schism, unquote, says historian Roberto Di Mattei. As Congar himself put it, quote, we don't need to create another church. What we need, to some degree, is a church that is other. And that's an example of the use of language where you're saying, in other words, this church isn't satisfactory. We need another church. But we're not going to say we need another church. We're going to say we need a church that is other.
Yes.
Something other than what it is, which leaves it very broad and very uncertain in many ways, or open to a new definition. And it's very clear now to some degree that this has happened. Your book gives us sort of a documentary accounting of the events that took place up to this pontificate. But I have to sort of ask about everyday Catholics. And, inside this church, this body of Christ of which we are all a part, what role do the followers of Jesus Christ play?
Yeah, I think that if I could just use the example again of, the young people, the Martini, that he knew that change takes time, and he knew he had to have the younger generations, right? So he had this whole book, Night Conversations, just kind of talking about how young people needed to be prophets and criticize the church and all of that. And we had the youth synod that we talked about earlier. And then there was some reporting done about how basically there were some high-ranking churchmen nowadays who were doing their own, I don't know, just different meetings and different talks with each other. And some of them were complaining about how too many young people wanted to do the traditional Latin Mass, and too many young people wanted to go on pilgrimage, the pilgrimage that has the traditional Latin Mass. And I think that this shows that there is a role that not just the younger generations, but just the normal people in the pews play in this, because the revolution, you can have the intelligentsia, or the people at the top theorizing this. You can have them trying to foment revolution, but if the people on the ground are keeping the faith alive, keeping the traditions alive, and following church teaching, obviously their revolution can't get off the ground. So I think that a lot of I sense with Martini, I just sense this idea of frustration a little bit with how the young people should be, they should be more critical, and they're actually becoming less critical, he was saying in there. And so I think that, definitely what people are doing in their families, in their homes, in their churches, it absolutely has an influence on how far the revolution can go.
As you said that, it's like Martini was wanting young people to be the kind of young person he'd hoped to be,
Mm-hmm.
and not necessarily maybe allowing them to be the young people that they wanted to be
Mm-hmm.
or want to be. So, I mean, it all comes full circle in some way. It's so fascinating. You end the book talking about time. How do you feel that time might gaze upon this period in Catholic history?
Yeah, I think that time. So time is it's such an interesting category. I mean, we talk about Pope Francis's idea that time is greater than space, and having patience. We talk about the church, how it traditionally moves very slowly, and then we talk about periods where a revolution can be prepared for a long time, and then things can just kind of explode. I think that this is a time of such confusion and kind of chaos, that we have to remember to look. We have to have a longer perspective on this moment, and I think we are going to have some moment. I don't know how it's going to come about, but Roberto de Mattei talks a lot about how, like, if there's going to need to be a future pope who can clearly kind of rule out errors, and rule out anything that may have been done, in the past, that needs to be ruled out, and just clarify things. I think that we will at some point, we will get that clarity, we will get that future pope, and everything that we've dealt with now, we're going to look back on it the way that we look back at other periods of turmoil in the church's history. It was something that we went through, but it doesn't have the final word. Chaos doesn't have the final word in all of this.
The book is Saint Gallen Mafia, exposing the secret reformist group within the church. I've been speaking with its author, Julia Meloni. Julia, thank you so much for taking the time to share everything that you discovered in the process of making this book today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to author Julia Meloni. Her book, Saint Gallen Mafia, exposing the secret reformist group within the church. Check us out on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, our website, thefocusingway.com.